Welcome back, everybody. Well, ain't this a surprise? I can honestly say that I am just as shocked to see this thing in this condition as some of y'all probably are. After what we thought was a collapsed lifter, a wicket valve train noise, now here we are in the final tuning stages of this Budget 318. So let me catch you up to speed with what's going on with this project here, and we'll dive into some basic tuning. Before we get started, I just want to say y'all bear with me because the weather's done shifted on us. It's about 40 degrees out here with the wind blowing about 25. So I'm gonna do my best to speak loud and clear try to be over top of this wind. My tripod recently broke too, so I didn't notice that till just now. So it looks like I gotta go grab a new tripod, but we're gonna try to get through this video without it. For some of y'all that's been following this Budget 318 build, we did basically a home rebuild on this thing. It's a 87 or 86 block. It's the roller cam block, but it actually comes factory with the flat tappet cam in it. So we did everything as budget as we could possibly do with this, including just a basic home job at home. Re-ringed it, new bearings, new rods, new mains, new cam bearings. We got a whole playlist on this thing, so if you want to catch up to speed on what's going on with this motor, just go back and check out some of our other videos. But recently, we during the break-in period, we thought we had a collapsed lifter or a wiped out cam lobe. So we just kind of parked it to the side and tinkered around with the old Plymouth Fury there for a while. But last week or so, I decided to dive into this thing and see what I could find out. After prying off the valve cover and checking all the valve train, everything seemed to be normal there. I was avoiding taking off the intake because right now the truck's sitting outside and I didn't want a bunch of leaf and debris blowing around in it. We live back in the holler, so right now it's fall time and like every 15 minutes you have to blow the driveway down, so. But that's neither here nor there. Like I said, I popped off the valve covers and everything seemed to be fine there. I cut open the oil filter, didn't find anything major in the filter element or the oil, so I decided to dump some good old Rotella in it and change the filter on it. And before I fired it up, I went through and just double checked a lot of stuff. Of course, I checked the plugs and all the little obvious things that you would check, and upon pulling out the passenger side plugs, I noticed that we had a blown header gasket. And sure enough, we had a major exhaust leak on the passenger side. For some reason, that second to last bolt on the passenger side header, it will just not cooperate. It will not go in that hole for nothing. I think what I need to do is take the header completely off and clearance the flange for that bolt. But after popping that that header off and basically repairing that gasket, I just, for testing purposes only, I threw some copper RTV on it, not expecting that to be the problem. So before I went and spent any more money on it, I just sealed it up with some copper exhaust RTV, bolted it back together, dumped some Rotella in it, put a new filter on it, fired it up, and wouldn't you know, it was an exhaust leak the whole time. So the whole time this thing's been sitting on the back burner, if I knew that it was going to be a simple fix like that, we could have been cruising this thing already. But now that everybody is up to speed on that, it brings us to the final tuning stages of this project. I've recently taken it down the road a few times just to get a feeling for where the carburetor was at and get a reading on the plugs. And the truck runs pretty good. We have a few little minor things that tidy up. The thermostat housing gasket is leaking, as you notice. There's some antifreeze in the back of the manifold. It's not a big deal, it's a very tiny leak. And we have a little rich and idle problem. So I want to run through the basics of what I do to try to remedy this. Really, it's pretty simple. I mean, these are Caveman tools. A couple flathead screwdrivers, a 5/8 wrench for float height adjustment on the carburetor, 1/2 inch wrench for the distributor so you can adjust your timing, a vacuum gauge, and an old school timing light. I mean, can't get any simpler than this. Most of this stuff you can probably find at Walmart, minus this timing light. That's a Harbor Freight special, but let's I'm gonna see if I can get this tripod to cooperate and we'll dive into it. Okay, most of the time the first thing everybody's going to tell you when you have a rich and idle problem with a carbureted engine is to double check your timing settings, and that's accurate. You want to double check and make sure that you have enough initial advance in the distributor, not mechanical advance, but initial or base timing, so that when the ignition lights, it has enough time to completely burn that mixture. And like always with any tuning job, you want to make sure that the engine is at operating temperature. So I'm going to let this thing warm up for a minute, and then we'll shoot the timing on it and get a vacuum reading on it. The second thing that you want to check after you check your initial timing on one of these carbureted engines, if you're having a rich idle condition, is you want to check your idle mixer screws, which on this carburetor we have 4, one at each corner. You want a good place to start with those is 1.5 turns out. So what I'll do is I'll turn the idle mixer screws all the way in, not super tight, just snug them up, and then back them off 1.5 turns. That should get you in the ballpark of where you need to be at. The second thing you need to check if you're having a rich idle condition is your float height adjustment. Now this truck's been sitting for about 4 days. But I did notice when I turned it off last weekend that the rear float bowl, the fuel level in it, was way past the sight glass. I'm going to try to zoom in and give y'all a shot of this. It's been a few days now and some of the fuel has evaporated out of that bowl. But if you look through those sight windows, there's one in the front and then one back there in the back. The rear float height, you see the fuel sloshing around in that front one. I don't know if you can pick that back one up or not. All I'm doing is shaking the vehicle, and you can see the fuel in the bowl splashing around. Ideal setting is you want that to be just like right below half of that, halfway in that window. That's where you want your fuel height to be at, just below half. And like I said, they both look equal now, but when I parked this thing last weekend, this back bowl was, the float height was so high, no matter how hard you shook the vehicle, you couldn't see the fuel splashing around in there. And what that's going to do is, that's going to allow fuel to dribble out of those back boosters, which is going to cause a rich idle condition. But like I said, this thing's been sitting for a few days, so some of that fuel has evaporated. So while I'm warming this thing up to temperature, I'm going to keep an eye on that rear sight glass and see how high the fuel level rises too. I've got y'all propped up here. It's no guarantees you're going to stay there. Hopefully it does. We got a major fuel leak right now, so let me tidy that up. We got fuel leaking from the hard line right here. Okay, I got that fuel hose tightened up. I see something right off the bat that I wasn't expecting. So now it seems like the tables have flip-flopped. It seems like the front float height is higher than the rear float height, which I haven't got this thing fully warmed up yet. But there's a good chance there could be some trash stuck in those needle and seats on both of those. So if we can't get it dialed in by adjusting the needle and seat up and down, we'll pull the needle and seat all the way out and make sure they're good to go, clean them up. I did have 3 fuel filters on this thing, but right now it's only got 2 on it. So let's see if we can get it to light up. Okay, y'all, so what I did this off camera. Sorry, I'll show you on the back one. But basically all I did was went ahead and lowered this front float height. That's all you need is a big flathead screwdriver to break that set screw loose, and a 5/8 wrench. That is your needle and seat adjustment. If you turn that thing clockwise, like tightening it, it'll lower the float height, and of course the opposite, if you back it off counterclockwise, it'll raise the float height. What that in turn is doing is there's a float inside this fuel bowl, and it determines when that needle closes against the seat, which is basically shuts off the fuel. When the float rises up high enough, it comes in contact with this needle that's in this float bowl right here, fuel bowl. And when it comes in the needle comes in contact with the seat, it shuts off fuel flow. It doesn't allow any more fuel in this bowl until the float lowers again. And then it just repeats and repeats and repeats. So if your float height is set too high, what you need to do is unloosen that screw, set screw, and you'll turn that adjustment nut clockwise. Just small increments, 1 or 2 turns at a time, y'all. Little goes a long ways on these carburetors. And then crank the engine, run it, and see where your fuel lands at in the sight window. Now, some of you older carburetors won't have a window. Actually, right here, it'll be a plug that you just take out. And on those, you just want to take out that plug. It's like a flathead screw plug. Take that out, and it's basically the same scenario. If the vehicle's on flat, level ground, when that plugs out without the motor, some people do it with the motor running, some people do it with it off. I prefer to do it with it off, but that's up to you. But with that plug out, if you shake the vehicle a little bit, you barely want to see fuel dribbling out of that hole. Now, these newer carburetors come with windows in it. It makes it a whole lot easier. So you can see as I shake this vehicle, you can see the fuel level bouncing around in there. Okay, so that's your float height adjustment. Clockwise, righty-tighty is lowering it because it pushes this needle deeper into this fuel bowl here, which makes the float come in contact with it sooner. And counterclockwise is raising the fuel height or the float height. So one thing to take note of here, when you're working on these carburetors, it seems complicated, but if you really just break it down section by section, it's not that complicated. Make one minor change at a time. Don't throw 4 or 5 changes at it, because you won't know what fixed your problem then. One small change at a time. Crank it up, test it, maybe take it down the road, do a plug reading on it. One small thing at a time. That way you know what was your issue when you do solve the problem. That way when you encounter it again, you'll know what to do. Because with these carburetors, they're going to need some tweaking and adjustment depending on where you live at. Elevation changes, temperature changes, humidity affects these things. So when you adjust on them, you want to know what to do to remedy what situation. So with that being said, I noticed as soon as I lowered the front float height, I cranked crank the engine, let it run for a minute or two, shut it off. I looked at my rear float height, and now it's so high you can't hardly even see it in the window. And this how it was the other day when I turned it off. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna lower the rear float height just like I did the front. It's the same procedure on this carburetor. Excuse me, same procedure on this carburetor. Loosen the set screw, turn your adjustment nut depending on which way you need to go, and then tighten your set screw back up. And then I'm gonna crank the engine again and see where the float height lands on both of these now. That could be an indication of another issue. This thing has a mechanical fuel pump on it, so I know I'm not worried about electric fuel pump overpowering, because sometimes if you have an electric fuel pump, it can overpower the needle in the seat and just blow right through it if you got too much fuel pressure. But this got a stock mechanical, oops, might drop y'all. This has a stock mechanical fuel pump on it, so I'm not really worried about fuel pressure. Yeah, it has a fuel pressure gauge on the fuel rail over there, but just like any of those fuel pressure gauges, they're all made in China. Ain't none of them worth a damn. You can't trust them. It's there just to, really it's just there to plug up that port on that fuel rail, because it only comes with one plug. So I'll glance at it from time to time. Of course, it only reads pressure while it's running. I'll glance at it from time to time, but I don't consider that to be gospel. I take it with a grain of salt. But on this fuel rail, this is a Summit fuel rail. Inside this housing, there is a copper or brass, some kind of filter element. It's like a reusable filter element. You can take that out, blow it out with carburetor cleaner, or whatever you might need to do to clean it out. You can stick it back in. It's reusable. Before I put this hard line on here, I had a rubber line with a Wix plastic fuel filter on it that you could see through. That was just for testing purposes, mainly to make sure I didn't have any trash in the tank after it sat for so long. That was in place right here, and the whole time during the break-in period, test drive and everything, it never picked up any trash. So I'm not sure if we got trash in that line or if we got trash in our needle in the seat, but I'm going to adjust this rear float height and we're going to find out. Now, a lot of old school mechanics will tell you, if you think you got trash hung up on your needle in the seat while it's running, take your screwdriver and just tap right here around the needle in the seat on the back of the fuel bowl. If you got a little piece of trash in there, that might shake it loose, but if it's a big chunk of something or other, that might not do the job. Which, if we have to, we'll pull these needles out. It's not that big of a deal. So let me set y'all up and see if I can give y'all a shot of adjusting this. Okay, hopefully y'all will stay where I got you wedged up against the hood hinge. Hopefully you'll stay put. I gotta climb over in here to reach this back one. So I'm gonna try not to get burnt by the headers. It's one good thing about having a truck, at least for a little guy. You can climb over in here and work on it. Not saying that it's comfortable, but if you have to, you can get over in here and work on this thing. Just got to do a little yoga. Now basically, like I said, all it needs is the biggest flathead screwdriver you can get, because you don't want to strip these out. I don't know why they don't make these out of like an Allen head or something. I mean, come on, Holly, FST, Quick Fuel. Somebody ought to remake these set screws with an Allen head on them, or something other than a flathead, because they're easily stripped out on the top or rounded off. But basically all you want to do is, hopefully I can break this one loose without stripping it. We got it broke loose. Y'all don't be like me. I went and grabbed some pliers, but I ain't gonna sit out here and mess around with this thing one screw all day. Anyways, I got that thing broke loose. I like to keep a rag close by because the engine's already hot. You might dribble a little fuel out of here, you might not. You don't need to really take it all the way out. Just need to crack it loose basically. And then you're going to take your 5/8, and depending on how high your float is already is, I like to start out with a turn and a half, 2 turns. So basically just keep up with how many turns you got in this thing. Sometimes you'll have to loosen your screw up a little bit as you go. This rear float looks pretty high, so I'm going to put pretty drastic adjustment into it. And we're just going to see if it gets any better. Idling condition. Going down the road, just snug your set screw back up. Going down the road under half throttle, this thing seemed to be okay. Did a pass down the back road here, wound it up pretty tight and shut it off and coasted in the driveway so I can have a clean plug reading on it. And the plugs look pretty good, just the base outer ring right where the threads start at, it's still a little bit black. So I know it's idling rich because it sits here and burns your eyes. You smell it on your clothes. And I noticed that float was way too high, so now we got that lowered. Let's crank her up and see what she sounds like. Now that I got those float heights dialed in, I'm going to go back and double check where I got my curb idle set at, which is the throttle, the idle screw right here on the side of the carburetor. If you got this open too far, you're going to be into the transition circuit of the carburetor and you're definitely going to idle rich. So I'm going to check that, and while I'm at it, I'm going to throw the timing light on it. I'm going to loosen this 1/2 inch nut back here on the distributor. That way, if I had to adjust the timing, we can dial that in. Okay, y'all, so while I hooked the timing gun up and tested that out, I went ahead and hooked up my vacuum gauge. I'm trying to do this all by myself with no tripod, so it's kind of hard to be in 2 places at one time and talk over top of this motor. So ideally, you want to, when you're checking your vacuum, you want to have this thing in gear with your foot on the brake. So you're going to need somebody to help you. What I do is I basically just lay this up here somewhere I can see it through the windshield and just do it by myself. This does have a small cam in it, nothing too radical. It's basically a stock grind of a 340 cam. So you should have enough vacuum to run power brakes on it and everything fine. The vacuum comes in right around, I mean, it's right there in the green area. It's about 16 or 17 pounds. or inches of mercury. So while I was doing that, I went ahead and hooked up my timing gun. And these are just basic cheap timing guns at Harbor Freight. They got a positive and a negative on it, and then your lead, clamp your lead wire onto the #1 spark plug. And if you look close down here at the timing cover, you see that I got 0 marked on it in white paint. We have a Pro Products balancer on this thing, so the balancer itself is engraved with timing marks that read up to 50 or 60 degrees before top dead center. So yours might not have that. If you have a stock balancer on it, you might just have one mark for the one mark on the balancer for the timing mark. But if you notice the cover on these things, they read -10 and +10. That's 10 before top dead center and 10 after top dead center. The mark in the middle is dead 0. So every engine's going to be different. Just depends on what combination you have, what cam, what heads, what intake, headers. You know, everything's going to affect. So with this one, I found that it runs best at, it's like 34 degrees initial, and then the distributor has about 12, I think it's 12 or 14 degrees advanced built into that distributor. Once I get me a tripod, I'll go more in depth about this and show y'all, but that is a mechanical advanced distributor. It does not have any vacuum advance built into it, so that doesn't factor into the equation. So to go over what we've done so far, we've adjusted the float heights in the carburetor, got them where they need to be. I double checked my idle mixer screws, those are setting good. I checked the curb idle screw to make sure it wasn't too far open and dipping into the transition circuit. I checked the vacuum on it, and we adjusted the timing, and we should be pretty good now. I couldn't make this shit up, y'all, if I tried. Tuned the carburetor up, took it for a test drive. Seemed to be getting pretty close on the carburetor tune. Truck was running good, good throttle response. Idle quality was perfect. On the way back, noticed the heat hand creeped up about 10 degrees and it stayed there. I'm like, okay. I leaned the carburetor down, so I'm thinking maybe the lean adjustment on the carburetor might have factored into those 5 or 10 degrees rise on the temperature gauge, and I wasn't really cruising at high speed. At that time, I glanced at the temperature gauge again. Everything was still in the same position, about 195, 200. So I didn't panic. I just pulled over on the side of the road and put the four-ways on and limped it onto the house, and well, as you can see, it only made it to the bottom of the driveway. And this, y'all, is why I call this thing voodoo. I swear this damn truck is cursed. Well, that's not good. Blew the lower radiator hose off. Dumped all the coolant. Motor overheated. Now we got all the damn fuel boiling out of the carburetor.